Uh, I don't see it on the channel though. Oh, it is. Oh shit! All right, it's working. Oh no, I cursed. We're not supposed to do that in this show. Hello everybody. Welcome to another episode of Beyond Talking Points with Matt and Matt. We're continuing our deep dive into Michael Malice's Anarchist Handbook. Today we're tackling chapter 4, which is an excerpt from Pierre-Joseph Proudhon's The Confessions of a Revolutionist, published in 1850. And now Proudhon is an interesting figure in the history of anarchism for a couple of reasons. The first reason being he was the first person to call himself an anarchist. So he coined the phrase, he coined the term. And then the second reason he's interesting is he's also the founder of something called Mutualism. And what that tells you is he's not he's an anarchist, but he's not, say, an ANCAP, but he's also not a Marxist. Mutualists kind of consider them their ideology to be a third way, so to speak, because Proudhon characterized it as the synthesis of communism and property, because he was for free markets. But he saw, obviously he's against having a state, and he saw the state as the arbiter of private property. And so he thought that he wasn't therefore against private property altogether, but he wasn't also, at least I don't think he was an individualist anarchist in the same way that, say, Max Stirner was. He was more of someone who, or he was someone who thought that the community was very important. That's my best way of introducing this figure. Do you have any opening thoughts?
Yeah, I think we can kind of just jump into it a little bit. One thing I would note is as we're going through all these essays, and Michael Malice's, he's the one who edited it and put it together. So he picked things, I think, for a reason. And it's not just that he's like the first person to dub himself that, but if you know where Michael Malice is coming from as an ANCAP, you can kind of, at least me, since I have those similar sensibilities, I can see why someone like me could get a lot out of reading this, even though, as we're going to talk about, I don't really have the same sympathies as Pierre does. So even though there's a lot of things I would push back on, there are a lot of things that I could see people who think like me reading and being like, this guy gets it. And I think that's part of what makes reading these people who would derogatorily kind of be referred to as left anarchists still worth reading to at least some extent. And there's a lot more, I think, common ground on some things than it would appear in a superficial summary, maybe. So maybe a good place to jump off from, and I think I think a way to get his ideas going is he kind of starts, and this is on, I guess, just the second page there. All men are born free and equal. Society is therefore by nature self-governing, i.e. ungovernable. And he who lays his hand on me to govern me is a usurper and a tyrant, my declared enemy. But this idea of equality did not appear in the earliest phases of society. When men met together, the first thing they agreed to do was to appoint a ruler, someone in authority. So, I mean, from the very beginning, he's a guy who's going out here and pretty much saying the government's evil, authority is evil, these people are tyrants. And even though when it comes down to it, me and him would agree on things like what authorities is legitimate and illegitimate, there is still this strong, non-negotiating anarchist, tone that is very present in this piece. And I think that's kind of why, even though like we have argued in the last couple episodes on all sorts of things related to politics, I think that's what separates, I guess, anarchists from people who are anarchists a little bit. And I thought that was interesting because, as you mentioned, he is a mutualist. and he talks a lot later on about how authority really it's not acceptable, really, in any circumstance, and that is the ethos of a lot of people who are like people who are in favor of mutualism and people who just want communities to come together and everybody works for the community. But there is that overlap, and that is not negligible. That was kind of my big, broad takeaway from this short excerpt.
Well, so I was kind of, I think, off air a while back, poking fun at Michael Malice for including some of these thinkers who we obviously would disagree with on certain matters. But your description of it squares that circle for me. If because I guess at some level, when you're talking about politics or you're talking about direct action, which could alter social relations, you can have what's the term? A mutual. I don't remember what the term is, but you can have an alliance between people, and you don't necessarily agree on everything, and you don't necessarily want the same things, but you have a common enemy, and you can consider them your ally if in that fight against the enemy. So all anarchists can consider themselves allies in that sense. They're all against state authority. But like I said, I think what interests me is really beyond that. And it does go to the differences among different anarchists. I mean, earlier I was saying he put more of an emphasis on the community than, say, some anarchists would. I mean, I think it depends on who you read in terms of the interpretation of Proudhon's work. Some would say he's more of individualists. Others say mutualism kind of finds a way to sidestep that whole individualism, collectivism debate altogether. And then, I hope this isn't too much of an aside, but going off of disagreements among people who want similar things, Proudhon was one of the people who led to the early split in the socialist movement between Marxists and anarchists. Another one, of course, was Mikhail Bakunin. Marx was both influenced by and very critical of Proudhon and Bakunin. It's actually interesting that Proudhon did believe in the labor theory of value, which is not what we're going to talk about today. But I don't know. I guess what I'm trying to say is hearing just both the overlap and the real disagreements among people, even of the same political philosophy. I think it really does help to hone in both on one's ability to understand what one thinks and one's ability to understand what other people think. I guess to put it another way, I think Proudhon does consider himself a part of that sort of a socialist struggle, but in a way that you would not.
I was actually thinking about a way to map this. I was thinking about this, I want to say, a couple of days ago, because I mentioned this when we were talking just before we recorded, but I've been kind of grappling with, I mean, it's kind of stupid to worry about words too much, but there are legitimate criticisms of who uses the label anarchist. And I guess I'm not too stingy with it, because mostly, you can always tell people to it's easy to ignore other people, especially if they're using talking points. You can just kind of dismiss them, be like, okay, you think I'm not a real anarchist? I do not care. Like, why are you concerned with what label I use? Who really cares? And in terms of dialogue, right, that's when language is the most important, because you want to make sure you're understanding somebody correctly. So if two people are just arguing over the true sense of a label, it's really arbitrary, because the real tool of having an effective label is just so people can communicate. So different types of anarchists squabbling over who's the real anarchist is kind of stupid and pointless. Now, with that said, I was trying to distinguish a map in my head of kind of why people who are like ANCAPs versus the more traditional left-wing anarchists are so different. And I almost had like it's like you have a line, a horizontal line, and above it in my head is like all the flavors of statism that I'm typically derogatory about. And you would probably differentiate between them a lot, and I would be less so. And this is why I think this map is kind of flexible, and it'd be something that people could just kind of personalize maybe in their own heads to really understand where they stand. But in my head, that there's like a horizontal line, and all the flavors of statism. It doesn't matter if it's democracy. It doesn't matter if it's authoritarianism. It's like being acceptable of government is above that line. Then, but below that line, but on the right is me, where I'm still okay with hierarchy as long as it's not the state and it's consensual. But then there's another line, and that's what separates people like me from a lot of these anarchists that we are going to discuss in the future that consider themselves like left-wing anarchists, and they kind of are opposed to really any authority at all. And that's where a lot of these distinctions really happen, because they would think that I might as well be above that line, because to them what matters is authority existing, and what I care about is the issue that I have with the state. But there is still a ton of overlap. And I just think it's interesting to conceptualize, right? Because all these different ideologies have their different deal breakers. So like a lot of the one that's most obvious in our current political discourse in the United States is people get mad at other states. And I'm talking about like people who are Republicans and Democrats. They look down at other states because those other states are not democratic. Right. So even if their government has less rules or regulations, it doesn't really matter, because they think that government's illegitimate because it doesn't derive power from a democracy or something that is similar to a democracy. And it really is like kind of, I don't know, just this thought exercise kind of exemplified where I am and where I draw the lines, and how other ideologies like left-wing anarchism and like just Democrats and Republicans draw very different lines. And I'll let you bounce off that for a second, but that's also why I kind of think anarcho-syndicalists like Chomsky, or even like Wolf, who had that Soho Forum debate as a socialist versus capitalist. I think they are like ridiculously removed from Proudhon. Like I don't think they really have much overlap at all. So I think that's something I kind of want to think out a little bit too.
I'm getting a little feedback from your mic, by the way. I guess the first thing that comes to my mind is this is why the term political science is so stupid. It's not really a science, or at least in the sense that biology or chemistry are sciences. I mean, political labels, there's not really one way, like there's not really one correct way to use political labels. I mean, you can look at the etymology, you can look at the history of the term, but in the same way that if someone calls themselves a Muslim, it doesn't matter who they are, I'm gonna think of them as a Muslim. Or if someone's a Christian, doesn't matter who they are, doesn't matter what they think. If they think they're Christian in my book. So yeah, we don't need to kind of gatekeep, I guess. Ideologies don't really need to gatekeep and say, well, you're not a true socialist, you're not a true conservative, because, I mean, and this goes beyond individuals' differences. It really just, or it goes beyond the differences of personality. It kind of boils down to what certain ideologies mean to certain people. It can depend on historical context. It can depend on, economic circumstances. It's like, here's an easy example. The new economic plan under the Soviet Union, when the Soviet Union started to get underway, they were having very bad economic problems. And so there was the new economic plan. The new economic plan was a way of getting the economy going again, but it allowed private property. But so are we going to say then that Lenin, who spearheaded that, he wasn't the one who originally came up with the term, but he implemented it. He wasn't the original one to come up with the plan, but he implemented it. Are we going to say he wasn't therefore a communist revolutionary? I don't quite. It doesn't really make sense to me. I generally don't go that route. But what you need to do then, like when we're having debates over words, then what you need to do is then say, okay, what does anarchism mean to you? What does communism mean to you? I mean, I've literally been called everything from a liberal to an ANCOM to a Marxist to a social democrat. And that's just one person. Which am I? I mean, there's no really correct answer. It just depends on this is why, I guess what I'm trying to say is this is why we have these conversations. This is why we do these podcasts. Words themselves really can't, in and of themselves, can't get you anywhere. It's how you use those words that actually elucidates the differences, which are the most important thing when we're talking about politics, in my view.
Yeah. And just to add in on that point a little bit, and I hope my microphone's fixed because I did unplug and plug that back in. So I've been reading a lot. I've mentioned this to you a lot, but I've been reading more books on China just because I'm curious about everything that's going on in that crowd. And the fact that China is referred to as communist in its current state is like kind of absurd, because there isn't a lot that is communist in any traditional way. And it just shows how like words get conflated easily. And it's how everybody puts things in different boxes. This is the whole thing where I feel like it was either Rothbard or Mises pretty much walked out on some speech from somebody who was a libertarian and pretty much is like, it doesn't matter, that guy was like a socialist. And the reasoning there is just, well, he talked in the language of people who are statists. And, if you have this line and then above it, everybody is really just like a Democrat or Republican. To a lot of people who are libertarians right now, they kind of don't care if somebody's a Republican or a Democrat. It's kind of all the same, even though Republicans would hate to be conflated with the Democrat and vice versa. But in the end, to some people, it's like, well, you're all statists. You guys don't care about me in the way I feel like I should be cared about, so I'm dismissing you. And it's so easy for terms to be misapplied. But I wanted to go down a slightly different road. So if you'll bear with me for a second, there's like a really influential essay by Rothbard that was called "Do You Hate the State?" And the whole point was, it was Rothbard really drawing the line that the difference between like a small government libertarian and like an anarcho-capitalist is if you like could press a button and that would just destroy the government, more or less. It was like, hey, you have this button, the government goes away forever. Do you press it? And the whole idea was, he kind of was like saying, hey, it's cool to be not, a fan of big government, but in the end, it's like, if you're one of us, you press that button like so fast you break your hand, right? And that's how you can tell, like, it's not just a I think they're inefficient. It's like, I think they do something that is deeply immoral, and I hate it, and therefore I'm pressing the button. That is what I think the difference is between people like Proudhon, at least from this sample of an essay, and Chomsky. And it's not to say that he has, I guess, that passion. I mean, he kind of does, but he had this paragraph I want to read off real quick. Okay, it says, look at the countries that are the freest. Are they not those where the power of the government is the most restricted, where the people generally take the initiative? The United States of America, for instance, England, Switzerland, Holland, and those are the most enslaved, where the governing power is the best organized and the strongest. Ourselves, for example. And yet we are always complaining of not being governed and asking for a stronger arm at the helm of state. And he kind of has this idea, too, that he hones in on earlier, about how everybody, once they installed a government, was really just grappling over the power of being a ruler. So then they could use it for their ends. And he was kind of saying, like, all these people just want the power. They don't actually want to represent the people. And a lot of the language, I guess, especially, I mean, in the United States, you can only have so much of an abstract conversation before people have to bring it down to earth. But people who are like Bernie Sanders are not going out of their way to, try to destroy levers of power in the government, even though they have the similar mindset as, maybe a mutualist does, if you really sat down with them and had them talk philosophy. So do you think that kind of distinction I'm laying out is kind of representative of something that is noteworthy? And how do you see, I guess, your role playing into that? Because I know you quote Chomsky a lot. We've talked about Chomsky a lot on this show. I have my strong negative aversions to him. But he is a person who told people to vote for Joe Biden. He's very much a play in the system kind of guy. And I mean, we did an episode on why you were still kind of not a fan of Biden, but that was for more particular reasons. So I just wonder if you have, I guess, thoughts on the interplay there between those types of political viewpoints.
Well, Chomsky, I kind of see him as playing a game. He has a very specific goal in mind. He's really because he's from that time of FDR and the New Deal Democrats and whatnot. So you could almost think of it as what Chomsky is saying is this is where I want to get. I guess he's a gradualist, maybe you'd say, or a reformist. This is where he wants to get. He wants to get to an anarcho-syndicalist society. But as you say, he would not push that button immediately. Well, I mean, I'm not going to go down a thought experiment, actually. But point being, I think because of when he grew up and his just the long life he's led, he kind of sees the government as he wants to maximize, I guess, the benefits of government while we are in theory heading down the anarchist road. So this is kind of something I've said before about my politics. It's a question of what can you do in the moment versus where do you want to be in the long term? Because for me, and actually as I get older and I think about it more, I'm becoming less and less sympathetic to the current system and more wanting to distance myself from that system. I'm even beginning to question the why one votes for president at all. But if I'm really passionate about a certain issue, a certain policy, then I kind of have to work. I have to deal with the current power structure. And that kind of shows, I guess, at some level how it can be difficult. And we sort of said this, I think, when we started the this Michael Malice series, but it can be difficult to map political theory onto political reality. I do have some more things to say about the government, but I'll let you, or the state and authority, but I'll let you respond first.
It's interesting to think about the incrementalist wing of movements because, okay, so bear with me a little bit. I have to reframe it from, my perspective or my side of the aisle a little bit. But you have the Cato Institute, and the Cato Institute talks about the Jones Act every day. And I don't know if you know what the Jones Act is, but the Jones Act is just to do certain types of shipping domestically, you have to use a ship that was made in the U.S. And it's really just this really dumb policy that leads to more shipbuilding in the U.S., which makes everything that's domestically shipped cost way more if it's on a boat. And it's really stupid and screws over people in Puerto Rico and Hawaii. Why does the Cato Institute talk about the Jones Act all the time? Because nobody really knows about the Jones Act, so maybe you can actually pressure some legislatures into doing something about it. And I think there has been movement on the Jones Act here and there, especially with COVID. So there's all these incrementalist things that's cool, Cato Institute can celebrate because they got a win against the Jones Act. And it's it's hard for me to get happy about that because it's cool, you fixed this. I'm still mad about 500 other things. So part of me thinks the difference between me and the Cato Institute is they're more mature and more humble, and they can go, we got one win. We want 500 more, but we got one, and that is something. The issue is, I think that's not correct in the sense that the people at the Cato Institute aren't ANCAPs. They simply aren't. It's not just a temperament thing. It is that they don't hate the state in the virulent way. It's not that they're ANCAPs being incrementalists. It's that most of them are people who are minarchists to some extent, and they're working incrementally. So I guess what I'm saying is, even though I could understand somebody like me saying, what can I do in the world that I'm in and it has to be this small progress because you can't just tear it down. Unfortunately, you can't get enough power to do that generally. To dissolve arms of government, to dissolve the arms of government, like you can't. It's much more challenging. It's not something that I could achieve, in the next month. But I could go and vote for somebody who might, maybe, or something, or I could vote for somebody who will limit it a little bit, at least while he's in charge, maybe. So at least that's something. I guess what I'm saying is, I just don't think any of those people who are going the incrementalist route at the Cato Institute are ANCAPs. I just don't think there are any. So it's kind of odd. Like I don't think it's a dishonesty thing or an honesty thing or necessarily even a temperament thing. I think it's just like in the core of it, Chomsky can say like, my ideal is every worker is a part of ownership at their job. And you have structures that are democratic in everybody's workplace, and this is a good goal. But he's almost, I see no chance of getting there, so I'm not going to fight for it. So why even have that on the table? I'm okay with fighting for this other vision. And that other vision is Medicare for all and UBI maybe and stuff like that. And it's not that makes him a dishonest person or anything like that. It's almost like he's distinguished between types of utopias, and he's accepted the lesser version as a utopia in and of itself. I don't know if the distinction I'm making makes sense, but I think it kind of has some meat on it. And sometimes when I talk to you, I feel like you're okay with doing that same thing that Chomsky's doing. And that's why sometimes I'm kind of a jerk and I'm like, I don't even know if you're real ANCOM, Matt, because even though you hate the state for all these reasons, I feel like you're accepting the statist utopia as a thing to strive for. Because if you really wanted the ANCOM utopia, the statist utopia that ANCOMs want, if they're willing to be a statist, I think it directly conflicts because you have to grow the government to get there. And the other one, you need to shrink the government to get there. So I don't know if you've thought about how those balance, I guess, because I think that is the crux of these two factions that agree on a lot, but don't agree on a lot,
Well, about the Chomsky thing, one more point about that. Chomsky's he's really in his mentality a scientist. So I don't see him really as someone who's very interested in having debates about theory. I mean, he wrote a book on anarchism, I know, and he does talk about theory, political theory to some extent. But I guess it just doesn't seem to be his way of thinking. So I think maybe that's his, some could say that's his downfall, or others could say that actually makes him more popular. Because at some level, it's like, well, Bernie Sanders is also someone who doesn't seem interested in talking about political theory. Does that make him less popular? Probably not. So it was almost like a question about tactics. Like, is it better to not talk about theory if you're trying to introduce people to theory? I'm not sure. That's a good question to ask. But I wanted to, I want to talk a little bit more about my thoughts regarding state authority, because part of the reason I've had so many labels in the past is, I can kind of see a reason for almost every label. I mean, there's obviously a couple labels in political theory that nobody uses anymore. Almost nobody will actually call themselves a fascist, for example. But I could see reason to call oneself this, that, or the other thing. And also, I do think sometimes, well, I'll speak for myself. My political philosophy is continually evolving. And I actually am moving away from sort of the ANCOM mentality and embracing more state authority. And I was actually thinking about this today. And I'm reminded, if I may do that horrid thing and quote philosophers, our mutual friend Kohei likes to bring up this German writer named Ernest Junger. And I bring him up because there's a novel of his, I think it's like one of his last novels. He brings up this being called the Anarch. Now, the Anarch is a whole other conversation. and it has a lot of other associations which really we're not going to go into. But there was a quote from his which kind of helps me unpack, I think, my relationship to the state. And that quote is, "I am an anarch, not because I despise authority, but because I need it. Likewise, I am not a non-believer, but a man who demands something worth believing in." And actually, if I may, there's another even better quote, perhaps. "Although I am not an anarch, I am not anti-authoritarian. Quite the opposite. I need authority. Although I do not believe in it, my critical faculties are sharpened by the absence of the credibility that I ask for. As a historian, I know it can be offered." And so I put those two quotes forward because at some level, I'm going to put this in a slightly provocative way in the hopes that it gets my point across. To be a true anarchist, you have to believe in the state. Maybe that just muddies the water even more. But I guess what I'm trying to say is I do feel hostile towards the state authority. But because I view the state authority as an extension on the community's authority, because in certain matters I think the community does override the individual, I see the state in whatever form we're going to think of it as necessary. Now, I was reading the article the other day that was arguing like, oh, nation states are going to be a thing of the past. It's going to be city states now. But whether we're getting it down to city states or or nation states keep on trucking along, I see some state as necessary. I see the enforcement of a communal property, I guess you could say, and communal authority as necessary. And I think one can have an antagonistic relationship with that, but I think it's an antagonistic relationship which one can't do without. And that's, of course, something that all these anarchist thinkers to some degree would disagree with, or they would disagree with my justifying the state on those grounds. They might be communalist anarchists, but they don't see the state as a part of that. They separate the community's authority from the state's authority.
That's interesting. I mean, I've talked to you a lot, right? We've had conversations for at least like an hour every week for a while now. So I could see you come into that line of thought, and that's kind of the direction I see you going in. I guess for the reason why we're talking about how you diverge with this author of this essay, because they make a very extreme distinction between the types of governments that exist and what they perceive as the community's will. And that, I think that's the thing that kind of separates a lot of like Chomsky and certain pro-democratic people or thinkers, or even I guess a lot of the status quo Democrats on TV who kind of like, talked about how the government's sacred or the Capitol is sacred, during all those riots 5 months ago, stuff like that. All that comes from the idea that they think the government's legitimate because it's derived from the people. And like, I guess Proudhon is essentially saying they don't derive their power from us because we didn't give them the power, and the only thing that can come from the people is bottom down. I mean, it's bottom up, and bottom up it can't be government. Government has to be top down. You can go bottom up to elect somebody at the top, and then they enforce top down rule. And I think that's what they're saying the problem is. Now, I guess what I've constantly heard is you kind of say that you think government is a necessity, and that's something you and I disagree on, and that's fine. We don't have to litigate that every time it comes up. But do you respect, I guess, what? Okay, so do you think the difference between yourself and maybe Proudhon is just the estimation that it is a necessity? Because Proudhon thinks bottom up rule can work without a ruler, and so I guess is your criticism of Proudhon saying, no, that's not a thing that is, I guess, valid?
Yeah, I think that's probably a good description of it. I mean, and I've said this a couple episodes ago, but I really do enjoy like talking to anarchists and reading anarchist thinkers, because I do think it's important for somebody, for there to be people out there who are not just going to go along with authority, whatever authority it is. If authority exists, then I want somebody criticizing that authority to exist as well. You don't want people blindly following authority, no matter what, and that goes for any authority: church authority, state authority, the communal authority. But and then of course then we're getting I'm getting into a question of how to define the state, or how to define a government. But I think we both agree that hierarchy, or that authority or hierarchy is necessary, but what we think of as justified hierarchy is, or justified authority is what separates you and I, and probably what separates maybe even you and I from Proudhon, who kind of wants to get rid of authority, maybe almost altogether. I'm not trying to straw man him, or call him a simplistic thinker.
No, I 100% agree with that. I think that is really the distinction between like you, me, and then people who are ancoms, right? Is because the reason why they would say I'm not an anarchist is because I am accepting hierarchies, and I happily accept hierarchies. Like, I think that there are a lot of things that involve hierarchies in the workforce that make workforces work out well. Like, I think the reason why people have bosses isn't because of like a Freudian tick of people wanting power over each other. It's like, I think there are different levels of I think business can be so complex and have so much expertise and so much differentiation, and there are business models people can't understand, and there's so much that plays roles in there to where it's like, I don't know how you could have optimal businesses without having hierarchies baked into the cake. And something as simple as that essentially excommunicates somebody like me from being an ANCOM, because they don't think any hierarchies are okay. Like, you shouldn't have to answer to other people. So I kind of in practice don't even think that's possible. And that's why the ANCAP talking point in response to an ANCOM is like, well, what if there's somebody who doesn't go along with the program? So like an ANCOM says, we want a bottom up society, and we think that's where it works best, and we can all run we can have a plot of land and run it fine. And then some guy says, well, I don't want to do janitorial duty on Tuesday morning, and I'm not going to. It's like, well, then what happens? Well, what's the recourse? And and the fact that there does need to be recourse means there does need to be authority, as far as I can tell, unless you're just kind of hoping that everybody plays along with their part. And I just don't think that's realistic. That's where I kind of push back for the same reasons, I guess. I mean, I was asking you, I was saying, do you think their ideas don't work? And like, I also don't think their ideas work. That's why I push back on ANCOM so much, because I think to get their idea of a society to work, I think they do need the authority that ends up manifesting itself in the form of a state. And then when an ANCOM criticizes me, they essentially say, well, you're making every business a state, every household a state, because there are authority structures in households and businesses. And I just kind of say, well, that's the acceptable times to have hierarchies. And those are all, I guess, more or less consensual situations. And then that's where you and I start to differ, right? Because now that you and I accept that hierarchies have to exist, we can go into like, well, which situations are they more okay or less okay? But then people like Proudhon, like me and him both want to hit that button, but I think his version of the world is going to get us to a new government. It's just going to be a government on a commune where people vote that everybody has to do certain chores on certain days to make sure their stuff runs smoothly. And that works until anybody says, no, thank you. So, and then you might as well have a state. Once you lose somebody's consent. But I'm presupposing my definition of what a state is on this conversation. And I'm accepting that somebody could say that me living in a household, having rules of a household, is a state to some extent. But that's why, if you're going to, I guess, argue in a quantitative way or in a qualitative way or even philosophical way, it's just like, okay, well, how broad should we use the word state? when is it helpful? I mean, to harken back to a past conversation you and I had about authoritarian, you thought my use of the word authoritarian isn't very helpful, right? And like, it's not, and it's like, I mean, I usually use it for rhetorical purposes, so I guess I'm like okay with that way of ascribing it. But once you're actually trying to suss something out with somebody, it is important to like agree on it. So yeah, I totally think you hit the nail on the head.
But to add further, I guess, to where you and I then would disagree, and maybe where I might fall more in line with Proudhon, is I'm suspicious of, I guess, living in a world where everything is considered private property in the way that we currently consider private property. Now, I know you don't have any sympathy to the idea of the commons, to the idea of state property or communal property, unless, yeah. But I don't trust, I guess maybe this is a difference in human nature perhaps, or just differences in intuitions, but I just don't trust the idea that, wherever I go, whether it's a park or a grocery store or the state capitol, well, it wouldn't be a state capitol in an ANCOM society, but wherever I go, name a place, it's completely private property altogether. Now, there are quite a few places I go to in this world are private property, like grocery stores. But I just think that private property and the interests of can cause misbehavior, for lack of a better phrase, and that's why, for example, I wouldn't trust private fire services. Even if we suppose that there are a bunch of private fire services, I would rather have an authority that has one fire service, fire prevention firefighters, that will take care of my fire pretty much no matter what. I don't have to make a payment. I don't have to be part of a certain club or have I get my fire put out no matter what. At some level, because because there is communal property, the government cares about the, I guess, property as a whole, whether it's private or communal. I'd love to hear, I'd love to, if you could convince me otherwise, then I'm open to that. But I have yet to be convinced. I know, of course, you and Keegan had that disagreement about the businesses, acting in the same way that gangsters did. In Keegan's view, that's how businesses would act if there was not authority higher than them to punish them in certain ways or just punish them in certain ways for those kinds of actions. And I think I would have similar fears.
Yeah, so part of this, well, so once I in an effort to have better faith discussions, I have to every impulse I have to say the ANCAP talking point slam dunk, I have to push those beneath the surface and try to give something substantive, because that's the whole point of the conversation. I guess what I would say is I understand why people have intuitions that are similar to what you laid out. And I think a lot of it is an intuition that is, I don't want to say it's ignorant of how things play out in real life, but I think the way things play out in real life that contradict your intuition aren't very apparent, and they aren't amplified. I guess an example I would give that I just saw today, and it's something I wasn't even thinking about much, was I saw that in NYC, so in New York City, there was a notification about how people should not use things that are energy rich because they don't want to have to do rolling blackouts because there's a heat wave. And the whole thing is, a lot of the times when we see businesses acting poorly, we don't know why they act poorly. And people usually then go and dunk on capitalism or something of the sort. But most of the examples that come to my mind of businesses acting poorly is almost always because they're taking advantage of a poorly set up incentive structure that is set up by a state body. And it's because it's usually a thing that only exists because the state demands it exists. So whenever people hate on capitalism because capitalism has a whole role in the war state, So there are all these industries that make their money off people in the Middle East dying and getting bombed. It's like, well, yeah, but they wouldn't be making that money if it wasn't this horrible, evil cycle that also enriches congressmen and senators and also furthers their political agendas. So it's like most of the time where businesses act poorly, it's because they're taking place in a corrupt environment that is where they're reciprocated by the government. A lot of times when business acts bad, that's why I see the root is. That's why when you have these problems like rolling blackouts in NYC, it's like, well, these also happen all the time in California. California has all these mandates that require certain levels of energy are produced in different ways. And turns out people can think of energy as, oh, solar panels make energy, oh, burning certain fuels makes energy. But these types of energies have all sorts of other different qualities, like how quickly you can ramp them up in times of high need of energy or things like that. And because you can have mandates that require, 30% of the sectors, say solar panels, well, that means in the highest demand times and the highest demand parts of the years, you need rolling blackouts because you can't keep up with demand because your thing that you can really ramp up, fossil fuel produced energy, but you can't for solar energy. It's a constant amount. You can't really control that. So I guess what I'm getting at is a lot of the failures I see happen in the gross abomination that is private-public partnerships, which I think is the true abomination of the 21st century. And I think that's what more government breeds. And whenever government tries to fix problems with capitalism, they create private-public partnerships. That's why I'm where I am. I think it's a quantitative assessment, and I think it works out nicely because I do hate the state. Like, I truly do. I think they're an oppressive force, and I think they're evil. But even if I abandon those intuitions, it's like whenever I look at a problem of capitalism, I see it as a gross, strange bedfellows of the most evil people seeing a profit opportunity as a result of government bodies. Now, sure, there are other examples of like certain drug manufacturers doing things that are bad and doing it for gain. But a lot of the times, industries completely develop based around bad incentive structures like intellectual property. So, I would just push back on, I think it's a common misconception. I think it's a misconception. And I think it's, and I don't mean to be dismissive of your view because that's commonly held and I respect that. But I think it's mostly a misconception.
This isn't really the best response to what you just said, but something else that I guess is becoming more apparent to me when it comes to my worldview or my ideology is because I'm becoming less and less sympathetic to the U.S. government as it stands. I'm still able to say some form of government is necessary. But I mean, the funny thing about the United States right now, and in my view, really is it's. So this is a quote actually. I probably have to stop quoting people, but this is a quote from Christopher Hitchens, he was talking about the Soviet Union, and he said something about like it was the worst. It was it was a mix of the worst of capitalism and the worst of socialism. And at some level, you could say the same thing about the United States government. You could, or you could say it's the worst combination of statism and capitalism. Let's say, the worst of the business interests and the worst of the state interests come together to just create an abysmal situation at home. Maybe stable, in the short term, in the sense that I don't have to worry. I feel fairly safe walking out of my room every day. I don't have to worry about, it's not as much of a destabilizing situation as it would be if I were in Syria. But still, I see. So I too am willing to say then that the state is evil right now. But that doesn't, from my perspective, the state in the abstract is not necessarily evil. But the American experiment has just degenerated. It was kind of I mean, it's something you could almost say it was built on lies, but I mean, I think there was reasons to be hopeful about it at the outset. It was kind of a break with what had come previously, but again, due to various factors, it is not living up to the romanticized ideal of America. So I'm actually probably becoming more critical of the state that you and I live under. We can agree on that much.
Yeah, I think I'm a little conflicted by that take because I agree with the idea that it's like that the Soviet Union is like the worst of socialism and capitalism, and I'm very amenable to the idea that the United States is like a bastardization of both of those things. But I could name a country that is combining their government with their market forces in a way that is something I would be sympathetic to. And it's not to say that it can't exist just because it doesn't exist right now. I'm okay with that, I guess, cop out a little bit. But like, I think the Eurozone is doing a lot of the same bad things the United States does, at least when it comes to monetary policy. I think they have the same bad policies where they, screw around with interest rates and they cause all sorts of bubbles. And I think that is the bad dance of financiers and bankers trying to steer an economy a certain direction and then creating future problems. If you look at China, you have the authoritarians in terms of, I guess, they're more violent and they're more ideological, but they also kind of just let manufacturing do their thing. And they've brought a ton of people out of poverty, even though they've become violently authoritarian, at least in some regards. But they've done a great service to a lot of people that live there, in the sense that their average quality of life has increased like tenfold, I think, over like the last 50 years. So you have to give them some credit there, but still, it's like, well, China's not doing a good thing though. China's still very, very, I guess, evil in a lot of ways. And then Africa is kind of being, I guess, I know I'm going to the world stage, but that's kind of the point, I guess, is Africa has historically been, post imperialization, they've really had a lot of like bad rulers. And now they're looking to, I guess, take China's place 15 years ago, start rolling into that now. They're getting some investments. They're leaning into manufacturing, and they kind of still have an authoritarian streak in a lot of countries there. So I guess what I'm saying is the United States does all these things terribly, and it disgusts me, and it pretty much makes me sick to my stomach. And I really hate the United States government. But when somebody says, why don't you move to the Congo? It's like a stupid point. Because it misunderstands the point that just because the United States does all these things awful, it doesn't mean that this isn't a present issue pretty much anytime the state comes along and does something. And even though some people point to, say, countries in Europe having good healthcare, it's like, well, yeah, but their government tinkering leads to usually higher unemployment by like several percent, and also leads to like lower growth rate for whatever GDP is worth talking about. So there are still all these massive policy failures, even in states that aren't authoritarian. And I have a hard time waving that off. And that's why I guess what you said kind of was, it wasn't that it was empty to me. And I know it's like, you're not a person who's like, I guess, paying attention to all these things, because nobody is. But it's just not satisfying, And I don't know if that's understandable. But that's how I was feeling when you were kind of laying that
out. Well, let me go a little further. Something else I was thinking about when I was thinking about the state. So, as anyone who listens to this podcast knows, I try whenever possible, or whenever it's relevant, and sometimes when it's not relevant, to bring in the history of something and to think about things from, how they progressed. And so when I talk about the community, sometimes the community having authority over the individual in a way that individualist anarchists really don't like, I go back to prehistoric or not to prehistoric man, and you think about hunter-gatherer tribes. Again, this is not directly addressing your point, but a little in a roundabout way, not related to the Congo. But in if someone in those little hunter-gatherer tribes of, let's say, 20 people, does something, say they're hoarding food, let's say that should go around to the group in a more equitable way. And I'm not trying to give a romanticized picture of primitive life, but there weren't hierarchies in the same way that there are hierarchies. There weren't hierarchies then in the same way that there are hierarchies now. So if that person's hoarding food, all right, okay, well, obviously you try to get the food back. You try to explain to them, you can't do that, buddy. And if they don't listen to you, if they persist in that behavior, what would they have done? They would have kicked them out of the group. You're gone. Now there's 19 members. You're not a member anymore. We see you. We're going to kill you. That's it. And so when I'm, I guess, defending the state here, not a current state necessarily, but the state, I'm defending, I don't even know if I'm defending the state, but I'm suggesting that it is necessary. And it goes back to that example that I was just using. It goes back to sometimes I do think that a group has more say in something than one member of that group. So I realize that is an abstract argument, which doesn't entirely refute the quantitative stuff you mentioned. But I am trying to help you further understand why I might embrace the idea of the state at all, even if states in their current form can be very dysfunctional, whether we're talking about the Congo or the United States or France or whatnot.
Gotcha. Yeah, I get that. It almost is just like, I understand saying that, and I know that my philosophical grounding and what requires moral justification, I guess, is just a completely different animal. So it's almost like I think I'm almost more Kantian about it. But when I hear what you're saying, it sounds like a consequentialist argument, and that's okay. It just sounds like the whole, if you have a hoarder and you have a tribe, you'd rather have an equitable distribution than have a hoarder. And I guess what I'm trying to get at is saying, in practice, if you try to apply that analogy to the world, it seems to me that leads to the dysfunction that takes place in all of the governments right now in 2021. And it doesn't really matter which country you pick. This is what happens when they say, hey, we want the government to provide this service. And it's like, cool, but the government providing the service causes these 8 other problems and these bubbles, and it's done the least efficient way possible a lot of the time. And there's all this corruption that occurs as a result. So it's kind of like, I feel like you're making a valid consequentialist justification that I just don't think it maps onto the real world. And I mean, I know that's I guess that's a quantifiable question for every issue you could go through, and you could read 5 books on it and still not have a good answer, being like, is the government taking over this industry actually something that makes people better off versus the default? And it's a tricky question too, because there's like there's the famous kind of like, I guess it's a short book, but it's by Bastiat. It's called like That Which Is Seen and That Which Is Not Seen, and it's kind of all about how, like, when you talk about economic consequences, it's not just comparing apples to apples, because when you take somebody's money, it's not just that they don't have the money now, it's that they would have spent it in this way. You have to consider the whole counterfactual that reality is working against. So it's hard to evaluate, but I guess what I'm hearing is that justification is an abstraction of a consequentialist idea, and I don't think it maps. And that's why I push back on that so hard when I can. But we'll agree to disagree, I guess, because that's what we kind of have to do, and that's fine too. And I'm glad you laid it out in that way, because I think that is a proper understanding. You can correct me if I'm wrong, and then we can kind of wrap up.
I think I probably said all that I would want to say at this time. There's always more to say in the future, and we'll definitely say it as we go on with talking about Michael Malice's book, and as we go on with this podcast.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, I think I think we got into some interesting territory there, and I think this was actually a good springboard to get to a lot of ideas. It looks like next week we're going to talk about Herbert Spencer. I had to pull it up. So we're going to keep going through the Anarchist Handbook, and we'll tackle him, and we'll bounce off ideas that brings up, because why would we talk about the essay if we could talk about the essay for 15 minutes and then talk about stuff that is the word of the day tangentially related to the essay for the next 45 minutes? It's like that is much more fun, and then it allows us to expand on thoughts that I guess we're more interested in through other lenses, and we can make incremental, that's another buzzword of the day, progress in philosophically evaluating these ideas. And I guess that's what we're about. So I hope you guys enjoyed. For any new viewers, I think this was actually, I think I'm kind of happy with this episode in the sense that we didn't shout over each other, and that does happen time to time. But for new viewers, you can check out our backlog on YouTube beyond talking points. We got like 62 other episodes on any podcast feed. You should be able to find us just by searching beyond talking points on like Spotify, Apple, Overcast, all the normal ones. If they're not on one, you can post comment on YouTube. We do read our YouTube comments. Carl and Horde, you had some very good points, and I was thinking about them. I don't have a good method of getting back to you with my answers, but your messages are always relayed our way. So we love hearing about them. And if people have thoughts, feel free to reach out to us in that through those means. Matt, you want to comment on what Carl Nord said to you? Is that why you unmuted?
Yeah, well, I was gonna say to him that either over voice chat on our own or sometime on the show, I will answer your question as to why a state-run education system might be justified. Because I was thinking a lot about that issue, and the comment about how primitive hunter-gatherers tribes would have functioned does work into my answer. But I'll leave it hanging and let people think about it some more themselves.
If your answer wasn't about prehistoric times, at least indirectly, then I don't think it'd be a valid Matt answer. And you can find more of Matt's content on YouTube, The Anti-Philosopher. He posts vlogs and other content about other stuff, and he doesn't have to worry about me being the devil's advocate to every other word that comes out of his mouth. So you can hear him elaborate on his thoughts there. I post on the Obey Podcast YouTube channel and podcast feed from time to time. And yeah, I've been pretty preoccupied because I've been digging into stuff about China for some reason. I'm just kind of, I guess, fascinated by that. I even saw that Bernie Sanders, of all people, wrote something for Foreign Affairs that I wanted to read because I saw the headline and I was like, whoa, this sounds like a good article. And I saw it was Bernie Sanders and I was like, oh my God, what is happening? So I got to read that and maybe I'll have some thoughts there. But yeah, so feel free to catch back up. I hope you guys enjoyed, but signing off for now is Matt. Thank you.